Hello, everyone. Welcome to Liam's Lyceum. I'm your host, Liam, aka Hemvar, and today I wanted to go over this nifty anthology, though it is pretty much in magazine format here, called Dragontales, which released in 1980, and it is edited by Kim Mohan, as you can see here. Edited by Kim Mohan, designed by Bryce Knorr, and it's from Dragon Publishing, Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, August 1980. So Dragon Publishing, of course, that is the Dragon, would be their main publication. Dragon Magazine, as it would later be known as. This is issue 100. I'm a fan of reading these. I mostly get them actually for the short fiction in there, but it's just nice to look through these and just get like a snapshot of the time period. In a sense, you'll see like ads for like old CRPGs and stuff like that. But this one right here is one I've had actually for a few years, and because it's significant actually. So I read a lot of D&D fiction on this channel, mostly Forgotten Realms. That's my focus, but I've also reviewed some Greyhawk novels on here, some Dragonlance, a little bit of Spelljammer, yeah, and some Birthright even, and Dark Sun. So I like to cover Dungeons and Dragons material. I like to play Dungeons and Dragons. I just had another session tonight actually, of Dungeons and Dragons stuff, but I mostly cover literature on this channel, and so this is something I got probably right around the time I started my channel, or this channel, I should say. And so it's been a while. Now, what is important about this one is that this is the third release of official Dungeons and Dragons fiction, the third one. And the first one was I see online mostly referred to as a novella, and that is the Gnome Cache by, I don't remember the actual name that it was published under, but it's by Gary Gygax, by Ernst something, or something Ernst. I'm not exactly sure, but it's Gary Gygax, just under a pen name. And it's actually a novel, and it was finished, but it just, the serialization of it in Dragon was not finished. It did not all get published for some reason. So, but if you look, apparently it has been revealed in his records that the whole thing actually was written, but it's normally called a novella because the whatever it is, 6 chapters I think that came out, makes it about novella length. But again, that's incomplete. The whole thing is a novel, and it just was not completely serialized. And that was the first thing to release. That was issue 1, is where the first part of that comes out. Issue 1 in the Dragon. And the second one to release, I believe was, I can look it up real quick, but so that would have been 1976, I think, is the first issue of the Dragon. But Quag Keep is after that, and that is 1978. So a couple years later, that has kind of like a proto Greyhawk. I think the Gnome Cache does as well. You can kind of see stuff with Greyhawk in there, but not quite a fully formed Greyhawk. That would have been before the Greyhawk supplement. And this, though, Quack Keep is okay. I've not reviewed it on this channel, but I have reviewed it on my blog. If you just go down to my blog down there, Forgotten Realms Reading, Forgotten Realms Lyceum. So this 1980 Kim Mohan, he is actually at the time is an editor for Dragon. He is not the editor-in-chief until 1981. But essentially what I get the idea from the title of this is Dragon Tales, is that these are tales like the fiction stories you would read in the Dragon. But a lot of the stuff in the Dragon, I guess a lot of the early stuff doesn't actually get the label of D&D fiction. For example, I believe it's in issue 18, you have a short story by Harry Fisher, Harry Otto Fisher, who is the co-creator of Linkmar and Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser with Fritz Leiber. And Fritz Leiber wrote almost everything. Fisher gets like no credit, pretty much, though there are a couple of stories published later by Leiber that Leiber gets the sole credit for, but were actually started by Fisher. But there's one story he wrote completely by himself, and it appears in the Dragon. And so what we have here, though, pretty much to get off, so this is kind of a spin-off. There was no other issues, though, and there's 10 stories in here. So essentially we went from one incomplete novel, one rather short novel, which is pretty typical in the 1970s. It's a DAW paperback. I have it somewhere here, right? My bookshelf is a mess, so and then you get 10 more stories. So while shorter than the other two Thane's already out, it is 10 more stories. So you went from 2 stories to 12 all of a sudden with the release of this. And so it is kind of important for that. And what's interesting about this anthology is that this would be predating Dragonlance, of course, by a few years. And this is kind of a mix. It's like this gives us a good idea of what early D&D fiction was like. I mean, because you get like you would get it somewhat of an idea with the Gnome Cache, right? But it's one story by one author. Quag Keep is very different than other D&D fiction, right? It's kind of like a portal fantasy almost, and like it has this gimmick of like dice attached to these people that are at one point or at the same time really people in real life, and also the characters are playing in Dungeons and Dragons, right? And so like it's very very different than the later Dungeons and Dragons stuff. This also gives you an early glimpse, and I think a good array of ideas of what Dungeons and Dragons fiction would be considered at the time. And I mean, we'll go over each story very briefly, but pretty much overall, you're going to get an idea that in some ways it feels very much like what people probably think Dungeons and Dragons fiction is. With all these Tolkien-esque races, fantasy characters doing party adventures, but there's also some humor in some of these stories. A couple of these stories are just strictly humorous, and the other ones have humor elements in it. And some of them are very strictly just sword and sorcery, and not really like the heroic fantasy flavor of Dungeons and Dragons that I've come to expect from reading Dungeons and Dragons fiction. Sword and sorcery being a very typical style of fantasy fiction, the most prevalent form of fantasy fiction at the time. Actually, it wasn't really until I would say the 80s until you get the more epic fantasy, Tolkien-esque fantasy taking off. In large part to Dragonlance, something like Shannara would have come out in the late 70s. And Tolkien would have gotten popular in the 60s, but he didn't really have his imitators until a little while after. Mostly it's the sword and sorcery variety, which is a bit closer to the heroic fantasy kind of very much not about saving the world, normally very focused on certain characters. It's a subgenre of fantasy I'm a big fan of. But let's go over the stories, actually. And we'll briefly mention some of the artwork as well and the authors themselves. So we have the first story, which is The Wizards Are Dying by John L. Jenkins. Very nice piece of art to open us up with. This has a very exciting start, actually. So it is a wizard facing haywire magic, and he warns his servant Grimsley the gnome, who barely escapes with his life. So we meet fellows in a tavern, very D&D-esque right there, who are discussing this recent immolation that's been going on, particularly with wizards. And there is also Dame, a cleric of the Brotherhood. We have Rakan, a dwarf, and Fandril, an elf wizard from Plum. It feels very, very D&D, right? You have the party, you have the meeting in a tavern, you have all these Tolkien fantasy races as well. And I would say probably an early stab at the success of something like The Sword of Shannara, but not nearly as epic as it's just a short story, of course. The story is rather straightforward. It's a fight into a lich's lair, and it's also one of the longest stories. It's about 15 pages or so, if I'm remembering correctly. The whole thing is less than 80 pages. And there is a scholar as well. There's a girl with a generic fantasy name of Arya. There is Manticore's classic party of adventurers, like we mentioned, and the world building feels like many generic Dungeons and Dragons world, and it's one I'm vaguely familiar with just because it feels like a lot of others, right? This author, as far as I'm aware, though, hasn't written anything else. I believe this is an amateur author. This is their only publication, whoever this John Jenkins was. So, and that's the opening story. It's interesting, though, as these stories go on, this is the one that feels the most generically Dungeons and Dragons story, and it's the opener, and that might tell us something, but also it's the only one, really, of the 10. And so the next story we have is Dragons Fosterling by Ruby S.W. Young. Similarly, this is the only story attested to her. Oh, and that first story, I believe the illustrator is that's illustrated by James Halloway. I don't know who illustrates this one. So this one is interesting. This one is one that has a little bit of a humor going on, though it's not super overt. It's pretty interesting, actually. Asgara is the daughter of a count, and one day she gets abducted by a dragon, right? They have an interesting relationship. Essentially, he teaches her things like magic, but he's rather wicked still, right? He has her pretty much to like lead men into coming to rescue her, and he just kills them and eats them, right? Type of thing, right? And so she doesn't really like this, but she treats it as kind of like a teenager. Like she's like the teenage girl who like is like super frustrated with her parents, but her parent is just this dragon, right? That teaches her like gray magic and kills people that come to rescue her, right? So it feels kind of like something of a teenage girl from the 80s, am I right? Which I don't know how old Ruby Young was at the time she wrote this, but anyways, it's kind of actually boring to start. Besides that, Asgar speaks more like a teenage girl from the 80s, which is this kind of interesting colloquialisms going on. Um, and But the end really ramps up the entertainment part of the story, I think. It's not very long either. It is definitely a bit silly, a bit feminist for the time, not like overtly, really, just, mostly in this teenage way. This one really, again, feels less strictly D&D, feels less tied to mechanics like the first story does. Young, again, like I said, doesn't have any other publications. There is a nice reference, actually, to the Saga of the Volsungs in here, the Old Norse saga from the Middle Ages, which was cool. I wasn't expecting that. So Ruby Young at least knew some stuff. She had at least some reading under her belt. The third story is actually probably by the most popular author in the issue, and that's Gardner F. Fox, who I think is mostly known for comics. I know him from his like Kothar and what's the other one? Kothar and Kirik, Sword and Sorcery stories. And this is a story of Nile of the Far Travels, who really all these stories appear in the Dragon, actually, and I think they're all collected later. I say later, probably like last 15, 20 years or so. They were all collated and put into one anthology where you could, or rather collection, you could read all of the Nile of the Long Travels or Far Travels stories. And this one from Dragontales is included in it. So all the stuff from the Dragon and then Dragontales. But this one is interesting. It actually is starting about Nile trying to expand his wine cellar, and he breaks through the first wall, and there's a second wall behind it. He's like, oh, it's interesting. So he breaks through that one as too. But he ends up releasing inadvertently a sealed green spirit type of thing known as Adonar. The power of a goddess that is his lover, though, protects him throughout the story. It keeps a good clip to it with godly things going on. It feels pretty sword and sorcery. The kind dealing with gods and cosmology and stuff and loving those goddesses, which feels a bit like Ed Greenwood to me. But yeah, anyway, so, but a bit generic, again, like kind of sword and sorcery variety as you kind of expect from late 70s, early 80s. But it's not a bad story. The next was one of my more enjoyable ones. That is Sir George by Carl Parla-Greco here, and it is about a dragon. The dragon is the main character. And in fact, when I read about it, I thought it might be like some St. George thing, slaying a dragon. But instead, George is the dragon, and this is rather comedic. So it's kind of like Shrek or Myth Adventures is kind of what it reminds you of. So a knight comes calling to slay George, get his head, win a maiden in matrimony. But things go a very different route. So it's rather short. I really enjoyed it. It's actually kind of funny at times. So nothing really to complain about in that one, in my humble opinion. Got some good art from this one as well. And then the fifth story actually was another one of my favorites, and it's Black Lotus Moon by Tom Moldvay. This one has some of the sexier art in it. There's a nude one on the next page, but this is actually before Moldvay was. I'm not sure what he did actually at this point for TSR or for Dragon or whatever. But this is before Basic, his version of Basic, which was released in 1981, which is what I would say would probably make it famous, the Moldvay Basic set. But in Biazon, we have Tamara. So Tamara is the main character, so it's a woman main character. Wakes with the man she spent the night with. She makes a swift acrobatic escape as the city watch it bangs on the door, presumably looking for her, as the naked man feigns sleep. She finds out from her fellow thief Saris that the Thieves Guild and Mayor have had enough of her, pretty much, and instead just tend to trap her, pretty much, and have her head. So we're also introduced to like a Conan-like barbarian, fur diaper man named Arngrim, who definitely has gets his comeuppance, which I think is great, greatly done actually. And the sorcerer Gorlon, who dreams once a month under the haze of Black Lotus. And so essentially, we're getting a typical sword and sorcery protagonist to form a D&D party. And when I say typical, I mean there's the roguish thief type of sword and sorcery protagonist, and there's the big diaper barbarian protagonist, right? And definitely leaning into those tropes, which is why I think it kind of works actually. That Moldvay definitely seems like he's aware of what's going on and how he's treating this. Tomorrow is like a little openly sexually, which is always interesting to read. It's hard to tell like how much of it is like cheesy and corny and right, because like if I read the same thing written by a woman, then maybe I wouldn't think anything of it. So maybe I'm thinking too much of it. But again, I enjoyed it. I wouldn't say it's great literature in many ways, but the ending was very nice. Then we also have a very short one by Roger Moore. Let's see if I can find it. As Honor Among Thieves. This one gets into like particulars again of D&D as a system, as it gets into like class features essentially, and someone who would be familiar with maybe I'm not even all that familiar with it. I would say AD&D, probably very early first edition AD&D, would probably get some of the stuff that's going on here. I do play like Castles and Crusades mostly, and I have like some first edition, second edition stuff, but I'm not really into the rules, and so it's pretty short. Like I said, I appreciated it. It does some interesting stuff, and pretty fast and quick. The next one is Ice Dream by David F. Null. The seventh story, it's about a young shepherd inspired by a traveling skald, and it's not quite going as we like to think adventure will. It's vaguely like the first Spellfire book by Ed Greenwood, except for that's a novel. This is the shortest book, or the shortest story. It's literally a page. And because this is the beginning and the end right here. This is the whole story. That's pretty much being inspired by the Skald, and the adventure doesn't go like you would think this called adventure would go. It actually ends pretty brutally, very swiftly, and very gruesome. And it's just an interesting again kind of reworking of the trope of adventure. But I could also imagine many, especially in Advanced and Dragons, where the world is a bit harsher, the game is a bit harsher, that you die very quickly in the game. So then we also have In the Darkness Hunting by Janrae Frank, who actually is an author again of other stories. I was not familiar with her at all actually before this. But this is one of the more interesting stories as well, one I enjoyed a bit more. So this is the third one I enjoyed more and found a bit noteworthy. And that's mostly because it was a bit more progressive than I was thinking it'd be. It's feminist in a sense, but it follows a woman. This is how she's described: a woman that lives as a warrior and a man. Essentially, the story starts. She's in exile, so she's not living with her people, and they seem to have inherent some supernatural magical ability. Seems like she's really kind of some demigoddess of sorts. But the story starts with the chief of this people that she's living with. They're kind of nomadic, very misogynist, but and pretty much she acts as war leader for this chief, and they're sworn as blood brothers. And she didn't reveal to him that she was a woman until after they'd already been sworn as blood brothers. Apparently, that was a couple years before this, right? But at this point, he's pretty much trying to push himself on her, and then she's like, "This wouldn't really work because as soon as you like sleep with me, for example, then like then I'd be considered a woman and I'd be considered a whore essentially, and then that wouldn't really work in the society because I only fit in your society because people think I'm a man, that type of thing." So she's really passing herself off as a man. She refuses, and then he really tries to push himself on her, and it's kind of messed up, right? And then it goes in an interesting place. It has some interesting ideas of love and like gender relations even, right? Like the love she has for this guy who essentially tries to rape her almost, and then also this other woman that comes into play who, for example, this woman thinks that the main character is a man, and so she's like, "Oh, hey, you're worthy, like you're sleep with me," type of thing. And she's like, "No, that would dishonor us both." And so it's like it's interesting play on like gender relations, right? And so it's very interesting, and not what I was expecting. Mostly just took me by surprise. There are other stories actually about this character, and the first time, this is actually not the first appearance. I would guess maybe the second, but I haven't looked it up. The first one is in Amazon's, edited by Jessica Amanda Samuelson, which I have a copy of. Again, I don't know where it is right now, but I also had to show you. And that was the first appearance. That was just the year before, in 1979. So I believe this author passed away about 11 years ago, actually. So I'm not sure what else she's really written, but an actual author, again, not just some random person that published once in this, or whatever. And then we also have Just Call Me Albert by Martin Munt. I don't really have anything to say on the this one. This is the ninth story before last. It is another comic one. It is definitely longer than the Sir George one. So the comic one could be cool, I guess. Rizzo is like a rat god. He's kind of playing a role in the story. And it is told in first person, actually, if I'm remembering correctly, which is definitely different than most of the others. So, and then the last story is another I'd probably say that was stood out to me, and that's mostly because it gets really into kind of the nitty gritty of the psychology of someone who is a powerful wizard, essentially, and not just someone that's like evil sorcerer like we take in Sword and Sorcery, or like one of the old wizards you take in modern D&D like Elminster or Mordenkainen or even Tasha. It's a person who's like a small town person, small town guy. It turns out he's got lots of magical powers, and so he feels obligated to go and use those to protect the kingdom, essentially. And it's him returning home after like 7 years, and he goes to see his mom. His mom really doesn't really have a good time seeing him. Right? They get into like this idea of what he's supposed to be doing, right? And they didn't tell him about like the sickness of his father, for example. So I mean, it's pretty interesting. And he goes to meet a girl that he loves, essentially. Birth of a Wizard here. And this girl has conflicting feelings because she's like, well, like I don't want to marry like a myth, essentially. I don't want to marry a legend because I wouldn't be marrying a man. Essentially, you've been denying your manhood by being this super awesome wizard, essentially. And I don't want to marry that, and I don't want to put my like future children at risk because of that. What if a dragon rolls up to town, essentially looking for this wizard, right? And so like it's very interesting, and it's really not long at all. It's just a couple pages, and that's the end of it. I did enjoy it, and I enjoyed the whole thing. None of it blew me away. I mean, but I did enjoy the whole thing, and it was nice to get this piece of Dungeons & Dragons history under my belt. Like I said, it's really the third thing that came out that was considered Dungeons & Dragons fiction, and that's kind of important in a sense as far as like the early history of the stuff is going. And you can see some of the stuff that would really, you can see them blending in progress, right, between the current Dungeons & Dragons stuff that we normally take to be Dungeons & Dragons stuff now, right, with the early stuff, right, because a lot of these stories are pretty strictly Sword and Sorcery in some ways, right? Black Lotus Moon or whatever, right, for example, has no demi-humans in it at all. A lot of these stories are just humans, right, which is pretty typical for when you're playing to something like Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, because you're coming from the Sword and Sorcery tradition. Then eventually the Tolkien stuff just gets heavier and heavier, and you have more and more of these demi-humans or other races, stuff like that. Also, one thing to note, I don't think there's any orcs in this at all, so we're not getting any of that, which is interesting. I just thought about that now. I didn't think about it at all while reading. So you don't see a lot of the same things. I mean, you have like liches, right, and manticores, right, but you don't have like kobolds or goblins or orcs and anywhere in this. So a very interesting, I think, perspective it gives you, and also just kind of like liminal piece between this movement from Sword and Sorcery to a later heroic type of fantasy and strictly a Dungeons & Dragons flavor of heroic fantasy, and how that is part of that history, essentially. That's one of the reasons I like reading literature and I like reading stuff like this. So anyways, Link from Liam's Lyceum. Let me know if you've read this. I don't know how easy or hard it is to get a hold of this now. I don't remember it breaking my bank at the time, but I really don't remember either. So again, it was a while ago that I purchased this. So, and I will close actually with this note that I assume that Kim Mohan put in here. at the very end. But it says, if you enjoy reading fantasy fiction, why not embark on heroic adventures yourself? Slay dragons, conquer evil, and quest for treasure in the world of Dungeons and Dragons. Copyright. The original fantasy role-playing adventure game. Dragon Publishing is a division of TSR Hobbies Inc., the creators of D&D, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and a complete line of other games and game accessories, besides publishing Dragon Magazine, a monthly aid for D&D and other games, which include fantasy fiction, art, comics, complete games, and modules. Dragon Publishing is also the exclusive North American distributor for the British gaming magazines The Wargamer and White Dwarf. Also, look for our 1981 calendar of fantasy art and trivia available on bookstores and hobby shops, or in bookstores and hobby shops, or by writing Dragon Publishing, P.O. Box 110, Lake Neville, Wisconsin, 53147. So anyways, let me know what you think. I thought about potentially reviewing issues of Dragon on this channel, because why not? I do whatever I want on this channel. So, and that would be fun. So anyways, leave from News Item. I'll catch you next time.